The most dangerous man in any room is not the man with the most enemies. It is the man with no one close enough to him to tell him the truth. Because the man with enemies at least knows where the threat is coming from. The man with no real brotherhood around him has no idea what he cannot see about himself. And what a man cannot see about himself will eventually cost him everything he is building. Today I want to talk about something that this generation of men has almost completely lost and does not even realize it is missing. Brotherhood. Not followers, not supporters, not people who hype you up when things are going well. Men, real men, men who know you well enough to look you in the eye and tell you when you are wrong. Let me start by telling you what I mean when I say brotherhood, because most men think they have it and do not. Brotherhood is not a group chat. It is not a circle of people who laugh at your jokes and agree with your decisions. It is not men who tell you what you want to hear because they do not want the discomfort of telling you what you need to hear. Real brotherhood is a covenant between men who have decided that their commitment to each other's growth, character, and destiny matters more than each other's comfort in the moment. It is men who will sit across from you and say, "I love you enough to tell you that you are wrong. I know you well enough to see what you are missing. And I respect you too much to let you walk into something I can already see is going to destroy you without saying something." That is brotherhood. And that kind of relationship between men is one of the rarest things that exists right now in this generation. Proverbs 27:17 says, "As iron sharpens iron, so one person sharpens another." That image is not accidental. Iron does not sharpen itself. You cannot take a blade and make it sharper by rubbing it against something soft. You need friction. You need resistance. You need another piece of metal strong enough to actually push back against the edge you're trying to refine. That is what real brotherhood does for a man. It pushes back. It creates the kind of friction that produces sharpness. And a man who surrounds himself only with people who never push back is a man who is getting duller every day while believing he is sharp. Now let me show you this in Scripture, because the most powerful men who ever lived understood the value of brotherhood and built it intentionally. Start with David and Jonathan. This is one of the most significant relationships in all of the Old Testament, and most people gloss over it because they do not fully understand what it cost and what it produced. Jonathan was the son of Saul. He was in line for the throne. He had every reason to see David as a rival and a threat. Instead, he made a covenant with him. 1 Samuel 18 says Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as himself. He gave David his robe, his tunic, his sword, his bow, his belt. He stripped himself of the symbols of his position and handed them to the man God had actually chosen to lead. That is not just friendship. That is a man who was secure enough in his own identity to celebrate another man's calling, even when that calling cost him something personally. And that covenant protected David. When Saul was trying to kill David, it was Jonathan who warned him. It was Jonathan who stood between David and destruction multiple times. Without that brotherhood, David's story ends before it gets to the throne. The same David who killed Goliath, who wrote the Psalms, who became the most celebrated king in Israel's history, needed a brother to survive long enough to become who he was called to be. Now look at Jesus. And I want you to sit with this because it is one of the most instructive things in all of Scripture for men who think they can go alone. Jesus was the Son of God. He had access to the Father in a way no human being before or after him has ever had. He was the most spiritually equipped man who ever walked the earth, and he chose 12. He did not operate alone. He built a table, he selected men, poured into them, lived in proximity to them. Let them see him in every condition. Let them ask him questions. Let them challenge him. Let them misunderstand him. And he kept showing up to the relationship. The man who needed no one chose brotherhood deliberately. If the Son of God walked his assignment with men around him, what makes any man think he can walk his without them? Paul is the third example, one of the greatest minds in the history of the faith, a man who wrote more of the New Testament than anyone else, a man who planted churches across the known world. And Paul never moved alone. He had Barnabas who believed in him when the rest of the disciples were afraid of him. He had Silas who went to prison with him and sang worship songs at midnight in a jail cell. He had Timothy who he poured into like a son. He had men running alongside him in every season of the assignment, men who sharpened him, covered him, challenged him, and carried the weight of the mission beside him. That pattern is not coincidental. That pattern is instructional. Now let me talk about what happens to a man who operates without it, and the clearest picture of that is Solomon again. I have brought Solomon up in multiple scripts now, and I'm going to keep bringing him up because his story is one of the most complete case studies in all of Scripture of what happens when a man who has everything drifts away from the things that were supposed to keep him grounded. Solomon had unprecedented wisdom. He had wealth beyond any king before or after him. He had access to God directly. And somewhere in the middle of all of that, his accountability eroded. There is no Jonathan in Solomon's story. There is no Barnabas. There is no man on record who sat across from Solomon and said, "King, you are drifting. The women are turning your heart. The covenant is eroding. I see it and I love you enough to say it." And without that voice, without that friction, without a man close enough to him to push back on what was happening, Solomon's wisdom could not save him from himself. 700 wives. Heart turned after other gods. The wisest man who ever lived walked into destruction one slow compromise at a time, and there was no one in the room to call it out. That is what isolation costs a king. Not all at once, slowly, one unchecked blind spot at a time, one pride-driven decision that nobody around him was willing to challenge, one drift that nobody caught because nobody was close enough to see it. And this is the generation we are living in right now. Men are more isolated than at any point in recorded history. Studies will tell you that men today report having fewer close friendships than any generation before them. The average man has no one he would call if things went seriously wrong. No one he would sit across from and say, "I am struggling. I am losing ground. I do not know what I am missing, but I know something is off." And so he goes alone, and he makes decisions in a vacuum, and his pride grows unchallenged because there is no one close enough to challenge it. And his blind spots become destruction because there is no one positioned to see what he cannot see about himself. And I want to name why this is happening, because it is not accidental. There are several reasons why this generation of men has lost real brotherhood, and almost none of them are the man's fault entirely. Competition. Men were never taught how to be brothers without competing. The culture frames every other man as a rival, as someone to compare yourself to, as someone to outperform. And so men hold each other at arm's length because proximity feels like vulnerability, and vulnerability feels like losing. Pride. A man who has been taught that asking for help is weakness will never build the kind of relationship where another man can actually help him. He will keep every conversation at the surface because going deeper requires admitting that he does not have it all figured out. And then there is the digital substitute. Social media gave men the feeling of connection without the reality of it. A man can have 10,000 followers and still have nobody who actually knows him. Likes and comments are not brotherhood. An algorithm cannot tell you when you are wrong. The internet cannot sit across from you at 2 in the morning when your life is falling apart and speak truth into you. Only a real man in a real relationship can do that. And most men have traded the real thing for the substitute and called it community. Now let me tell you what it costs you to build without it. Everything you are building right now, every goal you are working toward, every level you are trying to reach, you are building it with blind spots you cannot see. Now let me tell you what it costs you to build without it. Everything you are building right now, every goal you are working toward, every level you are trying to reach, you are building it with blind spots you cannot see. Every man has them. Areas where his perception of himself is distorted. Areas where his pride is blocking his vision. Areas where he is moving in a direction that someone who knows him well would immediately recognize as wrong. And without a man in your life who knows you well enough and loves you enough to tell you, those blind spots stay blind, and the things that are in them stay hidden until they surface as a crisis. A marriage that breaks down in a way that a brother who was watching closely could have seen coming 2 years before it happened. A business decision made in pride that a man with wisdom would have immediately identified as a mistake. A spiritual drift that started as a small thing and became a canyon while everyone around a man told him what he wanted to hear. Brotherhood is not an add-on to a man's life. It is a structural requirement for a king who intends to build something that lasts. So here is the charge. And I am going to be direct, because this is where most men will nod along and then do nothing. You need to build your table. Not just find it, build it, intentionally. That means identifying the men in your life who are actually sharp enough to push back on you, who love God enough to speak truth over compromise, who are building something real so they understand what it costs, and who you trust enough to let see you when you are not okay. And then pursuing those relationships the same way you pursue your goals, with intention, with investment, with consistency. Brotherhood does not happen by accident in this generation. You have to decide to build it. You have to decide to show up to it. You have to decide to be the kind of man that other men want to run with, which means being the kind of man who tells the truth, who keeps his word, who shows up, and who is secure enough in who he is to celebrate another man's wins without making them a threat to his own identity. Find your Jonathan. Find your Barnabas. Find the men who will run with you into the fire and tell you the truth when you are wrong. Because a king without a council is a king who will eventually be taken down by something a trusted man beside him would have seen coming from a mile away. And that is a loss that did not have to happen. Build the table, fill it with the right men, and watch what God does with a group of kings who decide to sharpen each other instead of compete with each other. Walk with God while you work for the crown. When he crowns you king, tell the world of the truth you found. That's king-level mindset. Kings don't beg. Kings don't bow. Kings build.